Tuesday, January 12th, greatest common factor in distributive property 2 blue set. These problems are more challenging because they involve negatives in the expression or they involve subtraction in the expression. The first 5 involve addition with negative numbers, and the last 5 involve subtraction with negative numbers. So let's just review a little bit about what happens when you multiply negative numbers. When you have a positive times a negative, your result is going to be negative. When you have a negative times a positive, your result is going to be positive. But when your signs are the same, either both positive or both negative, your result when you are multiplying is going to be positive. I don't know if I said that correct or not. Positive times a negative is a negative. Negative times a positive is a negative. So when they're different signs and you're multiplying, you're going to get a negative result. When they are the same, you're going to get a positive result. So when we're first starting out, we want to ignore the signs to determine our greatest common factor. So when we ignore the signs and we just look at the 24 and the 2, it's pretty obvious that the greatest common factor here is going to be 2. So let's set this with 2 outside the parentheses. And you'll notice that there's a plus sign there, so I'm going to bring that down just like I did before. So this time the only difference is I'm going to be asking myself 2 times what number would give me a negative 24a. Well, I know that if the negative wasn't there, my answer would be 12a. But because I need a negative answer down here, after I distribute the 2, I have to have a negative for this value. So 2 times a negative 12a is what would result in a negative 24a when I distribute that 2 through. And then 2 times what would give me a negative 2? Well, that would be a negative 1. So to get this answer up here with a positive factor out here, my values inside must be negative. But what if this was the negative? What if that was a negative 2 and I still had my parentheses and my plus sign there? How could I get a negative 24 up here as a result if I'm multiplying by a negative 2? Well, a negative times a positive would give me a negative. So here, I could still get a negative 24a by multiplying by a 12a. And the way I could get a negative 2 here by multiplying by a negative 2 down here would be this number would have to be positive. So when you compare these two possibilities, you can see that on every single element, the signs are the opposite. When I'm working through these on the video, I'm always going to start with the positive value out here. And then my second answer is simply going to have the opposite sign. Notice I didn't put a plus 1. I didn't put a positive up there because that's not usually how we write it. But for the blue set, you're going to have 2 possible correct answers for every single problem. Because we're dealing with a negative, either on one of these two values or maybe on both of them. Okay, number 2. Negative 18u plus 6. So looking at my smaller number 6, it is a factor of my largest value. So my greatest common factor there is 6. So I'm going to have two possible answers here. One is going to be with a positive 6, and one is going to be with a negative 6. So 6 times what would give me a negative 18u? That would be a negative 3u. 6 times what would give me a positive 6? Well, that would be 1. So when I go through and I think about the distribution of this positive 6, am I going to get this expression above? I am. Now, for negative 6, my signs are just going to be the opposite in here. 3u and a negative 1. Typically, we would put parentheses around that just to show that that is a negative sign with the 1. Isn't wrong if you don't have it there. So let's just double check. Negative 6 times 3u is negative 18u. Negative 6 times negative 1 is positive 6. Number 3. Negative 88 plus 32y. Finding a common factor here. 32 is not a factor of 88. And the factors of 32, the prime factorization would be so that would give me 2 times 2 times 2 for 8. 2 times 2 is 4 times 2 is 8. And 2 times 2 is 4. So I want to look at these. 4 certainly is a factor of 88. 8 is a factor of 88. Ooh, what about 16? Let's see if 16 is a factor of 88. Nope. So my greatest common factor here is 8 for both of these numbers. I thought it was, but just wanted to double check that. So I'm going to set this up as two possibilities, with a positive 8 and with a negative 8. So 8 times what gives me a negative 88? Well, that's a negative 11. And 8 times what is going to give me a positive 32y? That's going to be 4y. Down here, because this sign became the inverse or the opposite, that impacts all of the signs within the parentheses because I'm going to be distributing that. So I'm going to have opposite signs right here. Negative 8 times 11 is negative 88, and negative 8 times negative 4y is positive 32y. It's always a good thing to go back and check those just to make sure you did them correctly. So checking these numbers, 48 is not a factor of 60. But I do know that 12 is a factor of both numbers, and I believe it is the greatest common factor. And we'll be able to tell if that's correct after we look at the numbers that we end up with inside of here. I'm still adding. So 12 times what gives me negative 60C? That would be a negative 5C. And 12 times what is going to give me 48? That is going to be 4. Switching my signs because I switched the sign on the 12. Inside, I should have 5C and a negative 4. I'm just making them their opposites. So negative 12 times 5C does give me negative 60C, and negative times a negative does give me a positive 48. Number 5. Two plus a negative 14n. My greatest common factor here is obviously 2. So set these up as my two possibilities. 2 times what would give me 2? That would be 1. And 2 times what would give me a negative 14? That would be a negative 7n. With my negative 2, my signs are just going to switch. This is going to be a negative 1, and this is going to be just 7n. So double checking that, negative times negative is positive 2. Negative times a positive 7n gives me a negative 14n.